And the Defence Minister, Marise Payne, joined me in the studio just a short time ago. Marise Payne, thank you very much for being with us.
Great to see you, Emma.
Please explain for our audience, if you will, why it's urgent at a time when debt and deficit is growing, why we need to spend $50 billion on military submarines, the most ever spent on an infrastructure project in Australian history.
I think that the government has set the scene for this acquisition, this procurement process, most particularly through the Defence White Paper, which was released in February of this year. We've laid out the strategic environment in which we find ourselves and what is a very dynamic and changeable environment, and through a force structure review, which was also commissioned through the defence processes that was the foundation for the White Paper, we've made it very clear that there's a number of pieces of capability, this one included, that we believe Australia needs to pursue to ensure that we have the best possible protection for our national security, the best capability we can. And we have gradually, in the past few months, come to the fruition of a number of those processes, and today, with the announcement of the submarines, was the most recent one of those.
It's no secret that China was specifically upset by the Defence White Paper you mentioned and its discussion of Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea. How big a security threat does the Australian government see Beijing's increasingly muscular posture in the region?
Well, we've been very clear in relation to our views, particularly around activities in the South China Sea and more broadly, that although we don't take a position or express an opinion on the claims of the various parties, what we want to make very clear is that we expect the rule of law, the international rule of law, to be observed. We expect that freedom of overflight, freedom of navigation will be preserved in movements around the area. We will continue to reiterate that view very, very clearly, both to our Chinese neighbours and more broadly.
American Vice Admiral Joseph Malloy recently noted that by 2029, China will have at least 70 attack submarines. Our 12 won't be any match for them, will they, even if ours are regionally superior?
Well, we are part of a very broad contribution in the region, and we obviously work very closely with our allies, the United States, and other parties within the region to make sure that we present the appropriately strong and determined position that we need to. We've been very clear about that and also made this acquisition process an important part of that calculation. How
will the Australian government measure return on that $50 billion investment?
Well, I think one of the most important things that I can talk about is the observation the Prime Minister made today about Australian jobs, an Australian build, Australian workers, Australian steel. Part of the plan of the government in creating this level of naval capability, both through surface ships and submarines, is ensuring that for the first time we have a continuous naval shipbuilding industry in this country. Now, we've before placed shipbuild orders, most certainly, but they have been single projects and have led to a boom and bust process. So what that means is you leave yourself open to losing the skills, losing the capacity amongst your workers and amongst your yards. We're very determined to avoid doing that. So the return to Australian industry, to the Australian economy, the capacity that we will have to engage, to innovate, to use our cutting-edge science and technology, particularly in these acquisitions, is going to be a very important measure.
What proportion of the build will be done in Australia versus France and the United States?
Well, this is an Australian build of the 12 future submarines. That means that it will be built in Adelaide at the shipyards there. It means that through the Australian Industry Involvement Program, which each of the CEP participants was required to complete, and certainly DCNS did that, through our Defence Industry Policy Statement, through ensuring that we now recognise industry as a fundamental input to capability, and through our Centre for Defence Industry Capability, also located in Adelaide, that the overwhelming majority of this build will be Australian-based.
Now, but what proportion? We know some of it, for instance, the nose cone we hear is going to have to be built in France, and obviously the combat systems will come from the United States.
The weapon system, the weapon itself, in the heavy torpedo, the Mark 48 torpedo, the ABGYN combat system, they are part of the United States ability to work with us on these very important pieces of technology.
So I guess the question is it the assembly in Australia or the build?
It's the build. Overwhelmingly the build, and I think that is the most important message for Australian workers. One of the things about being at the yard at Adelaide today was the chance to say to the men and women that we met, and we met some involved in the Collins-class sustainment, we met some involved in the AWD program, that we have such great faith in the capacity of the Australian workforce to rise to the challenge, for new workers to come in, because this is a very significant undertaking. In this alone, 1,100 jobs on the build and 1,750 from the supply line process, the supply chain process. We were able to say to a number of those workers today, this is the future for naval shipbuilding in this country, and you are an integral part of it.
How many of the 12 submarines will be built in Australia?
The 12 of them.
Because we hear reports suggesting the winning bidders, DCNS, expect to at least build the first of the 12 in France.
Well, we've indicated very clearly that the 12 submarines will be built here in Australia.
The opposition leader, Bill Shorten, has committed a future Labor government to building, maintaining and sustaining all those 12 submarines in Australia. So what you're saying is your commitment is the same?
Yes, in fact, we have a very effective maintenance and sustainment industry already, both in Adelaide and in Perth. They will continue and grow because, of course, we're doubling the size of the fleet, and we will have crossover between the Collins-class and the future submarine fleets as we phase one out and start with the new one. So definitely in that case, and the build is 12 submarines in Adelaide.
We know there were cost overruns and inefficiencies and productivity problems with the Collins-class and the AWD alliance. What lessons were learnt for the Australian government through those processes?
One of the really important lessons was about making sure that the design is complete, the design is right, and that we don't push go too soon on that process. So what we're talking about here is the most complex piece of naval capability, in fact of defence capability, many people would say man-made in the world. So we need to make sure that the design process that we work through with DCNS is complete and is ready to go when the experts tell us that. I think it would be very short-sighted to try and draw a calendar line on that in an artificial way for the purposes of Labor or somebody else meeting a political challenge, because we want to make very sure that the capability we get is the capability we need for Australia to have the regionally superior submarines that we need.
When will the 12 be ready?
So the process starts now in 2016 in terms of the design, with the aim of having the first boats in the water in the early 2030s.
The Australian government today promised this deal with France will create 2,800 jobs or thereabouts in South Australia. We're hearing now from the French media that DCNS says the arrangement with Australia will keep 4,000 people employed at their plant in France. If they're mostly being built in Australia, how is it that 40% more jobs will be created in France than here?
Well, I think there's some enthusiasm around translation involved in that, for starters, from the French to the English, and perhaps French to Australian, even worse. But the most important aspect of this is that our modelling and our plans clearly show us that it is 1,100 jobs in the shipbuilding process, potentially 750 jobs in the supply chain process, and that's without even taking into account the surface ship announcement that we made last week. Most certainly, given that DCNS are the preferred tenderer and the designer with Australia of the new Australian future submarine, of course there will be engagement in France, but let's temper the enthusiasm with a little bit of reality.
OK, I just want to shift to something else, because we learned today that your partner, Stuart Ayres, who is the New South Wales Minister for Trade, was last week in France and sought a meeting with DCNS, which apparently did not go ahead. I want to know, did you try in any way to intervene to seek that meeting between Stuart Ayres and members of DCNS last week?
No, I understand that that is part of a series of meetings that any trade minister from Australia, from any state in the Commonwealth, frankly, would endeavour to have with participants in the CEP process. As you've indicated, the meeting didn't proceed. I understand from his statement due to times not merging with the appropriate program that he had, and finally, I in no way approached Defence or engaged with Defence on this matter.
Or anybody else in France or any other official to try to influence whether or not this meeting should go ahead?
No, and I think clearly certain individuals might be trying to make mischief, but I I'm very happy to make those assurances.
You understand it's reasonable to ask the question, given the coincidence of the New South Wales Trade Minister being in France in the same week that the National Security Committee of the Cabinet is discussing this very project, and he's seeking a meeting with the tenderer who eventually wins the bid.
Oh, indeed, and as I've said, I think as part of the ongoing process for most trade ministers in the country, the assiduous efforts of the Germans, the Japanese and the French to meet with all of them are on the record and declared right around the country, and I would expect all of my colleagues at state and federal level to make their best endeavours to ensure that Australia is shown in the best light in this CEP process, and I'm sure that's what they've done.
And it's right to assume that New South Wales, like many other states, I suppose, will be benefiting from this project.
Well, we have a long way to go in the design process, but if my text message library is anything to go by, then we can start with Tasmania, you can move up through Victoria, through New South Wales, through to Queensland, back around to Western Australia, and the NT and the ACT also have bids that they would like to see come to fruition as well for their involvement. This is truly going to be a national endeavour or a national enterprise, whatever you would like to call it. It is a seminal point in our ability to acquire key naval platforms that we need for Australia's national security and for the best possible ability for Navy to do the job that we ask them to do every day of the week. And the men and women of the RAN are going to be the beneficiaries of a regeneration of naval ability in this country that we haven't seen since World War II.
Minister, I appreciate the time you've taken to speak to Lateline tonight.
Thanks, Emma.